is an author. Jeffrey, I want to make sure I pronounce your last name correctly. Is it Boutwell or Boutwell, sir?
Thank you. It's Boutwell.
Boutwell, very nice. Okay. And
Yep.
the book is called Boutwell, Radical Republican and Champion of Democracy. And it's the first major biography of an important public figure who has long been hiding in plain sight, George Sewell Boutwell, written by his distant cousin Jeffrey, who's a historian, policy specialist, and one of George's, of course, descendants there. Welcome to the program, Jeffrey. You're on with Bill and Maria, and I'm Rob. Great to have you.
Hi, Bill, Maria, and Rob. Nice to be here.
Jeffrey, thank you.
Thank you.
Now, we have interviewed a fair number of authors in the past, but you would be the first one who has a relative who worked with Abraham Lincoln. So I had to kind of jump on this one when it came across the desk. Tell me the tie-in here, Jeffrey.
Sure. As I say, George Boutwell has long been hiding in plain sight. He was kind of neglected or dismissed by historians for many, many years, but he is quite consequential to Civil War and Reconstruction and Gilded Era politics, having worked closely with Lincoln, also with Ulysses Grant. He led the impeachment of Andrew Johnson. But the link to Lincoln, no pun intended, is that George helped create the Republican Party in the 1850s. He was from Massachusetts, of course, Lincoln from Illinois, but they were both working to create the Republican Party that could oppose slavery, and especially the extension of slavery to the Western territories at the time. George went to the 1860 Republican Convention in Chicago, played a very important part in helping to write the party platform, and then was appointed by Lincoln to be the country's first ever commissioner of internal revenue in 1862 to raise very needed funds for the Civil War.
You describe in the title, of course, it says radical Republican. Was he considered a radical Republican for his day, or would he be considered a radical Republican for today?
That's a question I get all the time, not surprisingly. A radical Republican for his day. And the term back then was a real negative connotation. It was, levied by Democrats against those Republicans like George who were fighting for black civil rights. Essentially, all it meant was that he, supported the 14th and 15th Amendments to the Constitution that would provide equal rights for all American citizens. That's what was meant by radical. Democrats at the time were very much the party of white superiority. Did not want equality for blacks, but people like George and Lincoln and Charles Sumner and others fought to ensure that all American citizens would have the same rights.
Bill.
Yeah, good morning, Jeffrey. Thanks for joining us. You mentioned that
Sure.
that George was ignored or overlooked, yet the introduction you have provided to us about him should be anything but that. Why was he ignored for 150 years?
I make the point that George essentially was considered to be, for many years, on the wrong side of history. American historians for most of the 20th century had very negative opinions, say, of Ulysses Grant. Grant was considered one of our worst presidents up until about 20 years ago. He was thought to be a drunkard and corrupt and nepotistic and just inept. None of those things are true. Yes, he had a drinking problem that he got under control back in the Civil War. But Grant, in the last 20 years, has come to be seen as one of our better, if not one of our best presidents for what he did during his 8 years in office. And that's been led by authors like Ron Chernow and his biography of Grant, the same guy who wrote Hamilton, and many others. So the better that Grant is seen, that is kind of rubbed off on George, who was Ulysses Grant's Secretary of the Treasury and one of his closest political allies and friends.
And the term that you used, radical Republican, you addressed that a few minutes ago. Was he viewed as a radical Republican in his day?
Oh, yes. No, and they actually, they wore that term with pride. He and Charles Sumner of Massachusetts, Thaddeus Stevens of Pennsylvania, they were considered the vanguard of the Republican Party pushing for equal rights for all Americans. And if Democrats wanted to call them radical for being so, well, they were happy to wear that term.
And I apologize for not knowing a whole lot of your story, Jeffrey, but how did you come upon this information, and what was intriguing to you about all of this?
hmm I grew up in the Boston area, fairly close to where George had lived in the 1800s. George Boutwell was the youngest ever governor of Massachusetts in the 1850s, but my family really never talked about him much. There are two main reasons that I kind of stumbled across this in the past several years. One, as I've said, historians have been looking much more favorably on George in the last 20 years. His role with Grant, his role in Reconstruction, his role in the impeachment of Andrew Johnson, who was trying to block black civil rights. So historians have been looking much more favorably on George in the last 20 years. But also, I was extremely fortunate. George lived in the town of Groton, Massachusetts, which is west of Boston near Concord, Mass. And his house is still there, the Governor Boutwell house, with all of his papers in it. And hardly anyone has looked at those papers for well over a century. And I was able to go through banker's box after banker's box of letters and reminiscences and whatnot that George had written at the time. So I got a lot of firsthand material about what he was doing with Lincoln, with Ulysses Grant, opposing Teddy Roosevelt in terms of the annexation of the Philippines and things like that.
You have an event you're doing this evening in Ellicott City, Maryland. What is it? A book signing? A talk?
Book talk and signing. It's the Howard County Public Library at the Miller Branch in Ellicott City tonight at 7:00. Also in your area, I have a talk at Shenandoah University on March 19th. The McCormick Civil War Institute is hosting me Wednesday, March 19th, 7:00 in Winchester, Virginia.
Would you how is the relation with George, by the way? How do you trace that through the tree?
I did some genealogical work. My great-great-grandfather, Rodney Cleves Boutwell, was a farmer in southern New Hampshire, and he was a cousin of George's, and George came from a farming family in central Massachusetts. So we can trace our, common relationship back through them to a common ancestor back in the 1700s. I'm always careful to say that genealogists are very, very picky about how you describe your relationship to people in your family tree. I'm not a descendant of George's because I'm not, a direct line from him, so he is not my ancestor. What we do have is a common ancestor.
In the description on the release that came out, it says George Boutwell would do battle during his career with American political royalty, including Henry Cabot Lodge and Teddy Roosevelt. What were some of those battles?
That was more towards, it differed depending upon the issue. With Henry Cabot Lodge, it was the annexation of the Philippines, and same with Teddy Roosevelt. There's also the Henry Adams battle that George had. Henry Adams was, of course, a famous family member of John Adams and John Quincy Adams. He wrote a book called The Education of Henry Adams in the 1870s, or describing his life in the 1870s, that just was incredibly critical of Ulysses Grant. And it really colored American historians writing about Grant for many years. So George did battle with the Adams family, the Lodge family, Teddy Roosevelt. And most importantly, guys, it was just, here's the son of a farming family from Massachusetts who was looked down upon by the snobbish Boston Brahmin elite. There's a famous saying in Boston that Boston, the land of the city of beans and cod, where Cabots talk only to Lowells and Lowells talk only to God. That's the kind of noblesse oblige, elite snobbery that you find in Boston, not so much today, but certainly back in the 1800s, of people who just look down their noses at poor little George Boutwell, who came from a farming family.
Did you find any direct observations about Abraham Lincoln in regards to how he regarded Lincoln and his thoughts about him?
Oh, definitely. Some of his letters from 1862, 63, George When he was revenue commissioner in 1862-63, he worked in the Treasury building in Washington right next to the White House. He would walk over to see Lincoln to talk about the appointment of tax collectors and whatnot, but then they would talk about the war. They would talk about George McClellan and who should be commanding the Union Army. They talked about the Emancipation Proclamation and how important it would be to both deprive the Confederates of their labor supply by freeing the slaves within the Confederacy, but also by enlisting blacks into the Union Army. There are many just wonderful, wonderful firsthand treatments in the book of George having talked to Abraham Lincoln.
Jeffrey, I'm struck by the span of influence that George had. The development of the Republican Party, the 1750s, early 1750s. The Roosevelt, Teddy Roosevelt, is early 1900s, span of at least 50, maybe 60 years. And then if you take into account his early years before the 1850s, how can any?
18.
I'm sorry, 1850. But he would have to been.
No, go ahead.
He had to been a very, very young man in the founding of the Republican Party, a very old man with Teddy Roosevelt. How did he keep that influence for so long?
Mm-hmm. I like to describe it, and of course I'm from New England, but I like to describe it as George's Yankee Constitution. He grew up on a farm. He knew the value of hard work. He had incredible physical and intellectual discipline. And the length of his career, as you mentioned, is just phenomenal. He met his very first president, Martin Van Buren, in Washington in 1839. George was 20 years old. He got together with his final president, Teddy Roosevelt, in 1904. That's a span of 65 years between meeting his first president and his final president. He was hardly ever sick during those 65 years. He just kept himself in really good shape. And it was just through hard work that he, managed to continue that long. And I always love to say that imagine that 80 years old in 1898, people like Mark Twain and Andrew Carnegie and others came to George and asked him to be president of the Anti-Imperialist League to oppose America's annexation of the Philippines. He was 80 years old at the time. He did that up until the day he died 7 years later.
Yes, he was an anti-imperialist, as we learned in your book description. Why did he feel that way? Any idea?
He just felt that it was the wrong way to go. If America wanted to extend its influence overseas, it could do so through diplomacy, through trade. We didn't need to be stationing American soldiers in foreign countries to exercise influence in those countries. And, of course, the Philippines insurrection or the Philippines War that most people really don't know about in 1898 to 1902, 1903, 5,000 American soldiers died and more than 200,000 Filipino civilians died. George that was not what he was interested in doing in terms of spreading America's influence overseas.
Were there any repercussions for him taking on powerful people?
Oh, sure. Yep. He got sidelined at the end of his life in the Republican Party when he opposed first William McKinley and then Teddy Roosevelt. But George was one who always put principle above party. And I think another little nugget in the book is the symmetry of George starts out as a Democrat in the 1840s because he's from a farming family. He's, labor and farming issues, but then joins the Republicans to combat slavery. At the end of his life, he left the Republican Party because he felt that they were violating their own principles by annexing and occupying the Philippines.
Did the exposure to Abraham Lincoln in his kind of younger years jade him in regards to other presidents who followed?
Not necessarily, because if George was fairly close to Lincoln, and he was even closer to Ulysses Grant. George knew Grant for 21 years. They first met in 1864. In 1885, at Grant's funeral in New York City that was witnessed by 1.5 million people on the streets of New York, George was one of the pallbearers. He rode in a carriage immediately behind Grant's coffin, took it up to Riverside Park, where it later was installed in Grant's tomb that people can still visit today. And during that time that he knew Grant, the two of them became very close, had a shared interest in protecting black rights in the South, in extending equal rights for all American citizens. So even more than Lincoln, George and his relationship with Ulysses Grant was one of the real revelations that I had in working on the book.
Was there any evidence that George was a facilitator of the relationship between Mark Twain and President Grant, the very productive relationship?
Good question. Of course, Mark Twain helped immensely in, getting Grant to write his memoirs and then publishing it and having it earn a lot of money that would support Julia Dent Grant and Grant's family after Grant died. Answer is no. George really had no role in that connection between Mark Twain and Grant. George really only came to know Mark Twain about 10 years after that during the opposition to the Philippines.
Can I build upon that real quick? I don't want to take away from the story of George, but this deal with Mark Twain and President Grant, as ones who may not know, Grant was dying of cancer and under tremendous pain, and he insisted upon taking no medication until he could finish his book. And literally, I think his biography, and literally, I think he finished the book and died within 2 or 3 days after that. And it was a masterpiece. His autobiography is considered a masterpiece by many.
Maria.
So at what point would you say, was there a precipitating something that happened in George's life that made him sort of, such an advocate for, getting rid of slavery? Is there anything that you saw that precipitated that, or just an overall, the way he sort of got himself to that point in his life?
Yeah, good question. And yes, there very much was a precipitating event. On the one hand, George, he came from Massachusetts, and that was a hotbed of abolitionism in the 1830s and 40s. So he grew up in an atmosphere of people who were opposing slavery. But the precipitating event that your question, was directed at, in 1839, in that same trip he made to Washington, where he met Martin Van Buren for the first time, he's only 20 years old. George is walking around the National Mall on a Sunday morning, and he comes across one of the slave pens that existed in Washington at the time. It was called the Yellow House. This is where slaves were bought and sold and where they were kept before being transferred to the Deep South, to conditions even more harsh than they experienced in Virginia and Kentucky. To be sent down to the sugarcane plantations, cotton plantations in Mississippi, Louisiana, was the worst fate that could befall a slave. Well, George is walking by this pen on a Sunday morning, and he meets an elderly black woman who is absolutely inconsolable. She's, grief-stricken because her daughter is being kept inside of that slave holding cell and is about to be sent down to Louisiana and separated forever from her family. And George writes about that very movingly in terms of he never, ever forgot that experience of seeing firsthand what slavery did to not only individual blacks, but in breaking up black families.
George, on that note, we are just about out of time. Where can we find your book, sir? Or Jeff, I should call you Jeffrey. George is who we were writing about.
That's actually, I'm proud to be called George.
Yes.
I've come to admire quite a bit. The book is published by W.W. Norton out of New York, so it's available all across the country. Independent bookstores, Barnes & Noble, Goodreads, and Amazon online. So just about anywhere books are sold, and if your bookstore doesn't have it, you can easily order it.
Well, you did a nice interview today, Jeffrey, and I wish you luck on the continued media tour and sales of the book. Looks like a fascinating one.
Thank you. And then people do come out to the event in Winchester on March 19th. It would be great to see you.
Excellent. And if you make it to Ellicott City tonight, too, there's another one even later this evening. It's a bit of a drive, but still. Thank you, sir.
Thanks,
Thank
Jeffrey.
you.
Great. Appreciate it. Thank you.